Willow Creek, United States. October 16, 1935. Temperature 54 degrees. In the small town of Willow Creek, an isolated village deep in the heart of the United States, an old superstition had long circulated among the residents. It was believed that the seventh consecutive son of the same gender carried a terrible curse: to transform into a werewolf with every full moon after experiencing great heartbreak. These local legends, passed down through generations, were feared by all, but for one family in particular, this legend would become a grim reality. Henry Miller, the patriarch of the family, was a man of few words, hardened by the tough life on the farm. He and his wife Elizabeth had 6 sons, all strong and healthy. However, when Elizabeth became pregnant for the 7th time, fear gripped Henry. He knew what the townspeople said. If the 7th child was a boy, he would be destined to become a werewolf. Despite fervent prayers for a girl, fate did not spare them. On October 16th, another boy was born, and they named him Samuel. From Samuel's birth, the town began to whisper. "The wolf boy," they said, pointing to the Miller house with fear and suspicion. Samuel grew up in the shadow of the curse, shunned by both children and adults, finding solace only in the animals on Mr. Johnson's farm, an old farmer from the region. Years passed, and Samuel became an excellent horse tamer, known for his ability to handle even the most unruly animals. He lived in the last house in town on Oak Street, near the foot of the mountains that surrounded the village. His calm and reserved demeanor gave him a mysterious aura, but he was respected by those who knew him. The curse, however, seemed forgotten, buried in the memories of a superstitious town. When Samuel turned 35, something changed. He fell in love with Sarah, a beautiful and lively young woman who never paid him any attention. For Samuel, who had lived in solitude and silence, this unrequited love was a deep blow. Sarah, oblivious to Samuel's feelings, married another man and left town. The pain Samuel felt was overwhelming, a whirlwind of emotions he didn't know how to control. Shortly after Sarah's marriage, rumors began to spread. 3 hunters returning from a night of hunting in the mountains claimed to have seen Samuel transform into a horrible creature under the light of the full moon. What was once just a legend became real in the eyes of the town. The news spread quickly, and soon everyone believed that Samuel was, indeed, the cursed werewolf. The descriptions were terrifying. They said his nose elongated, his white beard disappeared, and thick fur covered his entire body. His posture hunched, and with a leap, he transformed into a giant wolf, prowling the yards at night, especially on full moon nights. From that moment on, the townspeople lived in fear. Animals began to disappear, and terror spread. Children no longer went out alone, and windows were locked even during the day. Samuel, now a bitter man, walked the streets with his dog always a few feet behind, his tall, thin figure wrapped in a black coat and a hat that hid part of his face. When he passed, people averted their gaze, murmuring silent prayers, while children ran, terrified, screaming, "The werewolf," without waiting to see his reaction. Samuel's house, a simple wooden structure, looked desolate at the end of Oak Street. The gaps in the walls allowed the cold wind to pass freely, and inside, the space was sparse, containing only a bed, a wood stove, and a few basic utensils. In the yard, there were tools for taming horses, his only constant companions besides the dog that followed him everywhere. On full moon nights, the howls from the mountains revived the town's fear, with cattle running uncontrollably and bellowing in fright. One day a sheep was found dead, brutally mutilated, its entrails scattered across the grass. "It was that damned Samuel, the werewolf," shouted Mary, Mr. Johnson's wife, as the townspeople nodded in agreement. As time passed, suspicion and fear turned into something more dangerous: the need to act. A small group of townsfolk, led by Mr. Johnson, decided it was time to confront Samuel and end the terror that plagued Willow Creek. They met in secret, planning an ambush on the next full moon, convinced it was the only way to save the town. On the appointed night, the group gathered at the corner of Oak Street, all armed and nervous. They knew they were about to face something supernatural, but anger and fear drove them. They positioned themselves in the shadows, waiting for Samuel to appear, the full moon shining brightly in the sky. When they finally heard the first signs, a distant bark followed by a howl that chilled their blood, they knew there was no turning back. Samuel was transforming. The group moved silently toward his house, their weapons trembling in their hands. The tension was palpable, and every sound seemed amplified by the darkness. Then, from the shadows, something colossal emerged, a gigantic being covered in black fur and with eyes red as embers, charged at them with terrifying speed. Fear turned to panic, and the townsfolk opened fire, but their bullets seemed ineffective against the creature. In the ensuing chaos, the creature was hit by a well-aimed shot, and with a final terrifying howl, it fell to the ground. When the smoke cleared, the townsfolk cautiously approached, only to find Samuel's body, his chest torn apart by bullets. What had they killed? A man or a beast? The weight of their actions fell upon them, and in silence, they decided to bury the body right there, swearing never to speak of what had happened. Time passed, and the town slowly returned to normal. The disappearances stopped, and life resumed its course. But for those who had faced Samuel that night, remorse and fear lingered. They knew they hadn't killed a legend, but something very real, and the horror they had witnessed would never leave them. A year later, on a full moon night, two of the townsfolk who had participated in the ambush decided to resume their nocturnal hunts. They set out with their dogs, trying to leave the past behind. But deep in the mountains, upon hearing a distant howl, they knew Samuel, or what was left of him, was still out there, waiting, hungry. They decided to ignore the feeling and continue the hunt. The moonlight illuminated the narrow trail leading to the mountain, and the dogs, previously agitated, were now uneasy, as if sensing an unknown presence. Mr. Johnson, the group's leader, guided the others with firm steps, but deep inside, fear began to grow again. The tranquility of previous nights seemed to have completely vanished. They walked in silence for almost an hour, until they reached a clearing where the dogs began barking frantically. Something was wrong. The moon, high in the sky, seemed to cast a more sinister light on the place, and a thin mist began to form around them, as if the very air was poisoned by fear. "Mr. Johnson, we should go back," suggested John, the youngest of the group, his voice trembling. "Calm down, man. There's nothing here but our own shadows, Mr. Johnson replied, trying to hide his insecurity. But before they could react, the sound of breaking branches echoed through the clearing, followed by a deep growl, so low it seemed to come from the bowels of the earth. The men exchanged terrified glances, their eyes wide with fear. Terror gripped their hearts, freezing their movements. It was as if the air had become denser, laden with an invisible weight that prevented them from acting. The dogs, who had been barking frantically, suddenly fell silent, cowering with their tails between their legs, as if they recognized something beyond human comprehension was about to happen. "Mr. Johnson," John's voice was just a whisper, almost inaudible. Before he could finish his sentence, the creature emerged from the shadows, swift as lightning. The mist, once thin, seemed to condense around the beast, as if it were part of it, enveloping it in a sinister shroud. Samuel, or what he had become, was there, more terrifying than ever. The dark, thick fur, the eyes glowing like fire, and the long, sharp claws reflected the moonlight with a menacing gleam. Mr. Johnson tried to raise his rifle, but his hands trembled so much he could barely aim the weapon. The beast let out a growl that made the men retreat, instinctively aware that any wrong move could be their last. Before Mr. Johnson could fire, the creature lunged at him, too fast for any reaction. The impact was brutal. Mr. Johnson fell to the ground, feeling the beast's claws tear into his flesh. A scream of pain escaped his lips, echoing through the clearing like a death sentence. John, paralyzed by terror, watched helplessly as his leader was torn apart before his eyes. The smell of blood filled the air, mixing with the mist, making the environment even more suffocating. "Run, John!" Mr. Johnson shouted with his last strength, his voice cut off by pain and despair. John could barely move. His feet seemed glued to the ground, as if the very earth wanted to keep him there, trapped, to witness the horror. Finally, in a surge of adrenaline, he managed to take a few steps back, but he tripped and fell, terror consuming every fiber of his being. The creature lifted its head, blood dripping from its mouth, and fixed its fiery eyes on John. The young man knew it was the end. He closed his eyes, expecting to feel the claws tear into his flesh. But instead, he heard a different sound, a howl that didn't come from the creature, but from deep within the forest, like a primal call, something he couldn't comprehend. The creature hesitated, as if it were responding to the call. John opened his eyes and saw the beast retreat, its eyes still fixed on him, but now with something more, something almost human. For a moment, John thought he saw Samuel's face emerge from the depths of the beast, as if man and beast were locked in an eternal struggle, fighting for control. And then, as if deciding to spare John, the creature turned and disappeared into the darkness of the forest, leaving behind only silence and death. John lay in the clearing for what felt like an eternity, his body trembling and his heart pounding in his chest. When he finally gathered the strength to stand, he looked around and saw Mr. Johnson lying motionless on the ground, his eyes wide open in a frozen expression of terror. The wounds on Mr. Johnson were deep, but the most disturbing thing was the look on his face, a mixture of fear and something that seemed like acceptance. John knew he had to leave before the creature returned. Summoning all the courage he had left, he started running, leaving behind the clearing, the mist, and Mr. Johnson's body. He ran until his lungs burned, until the town was in sight, and only then did he stop, doubling over in a silent panic attack. Tears streaming down his sweat-soaked face, John returned to Willow Creek, but he was no longer the same man who had left. Something inside him had been broken, a part of his soul torn away by the beast that now haunted his nightmares. When he arrived in town, he was met with inquisitive and worried looks, but he couldn't find the words to explain what had happened. He simply shook his head in a silence that spoke more than any words could. The news of Mr. Johnson's death spread quickly, and the town went into mourning. However, there was something more in the air, something John felt but couldn't name, a sense that the evil was still nearby, lurking, waiting, and he was right. In the following nights, the howls once again echoed through the mountains, but this time there was something different in them, a tone of sadness, of lament, as if the creature was searching for something it had lost. The townspeople, now more terrified than ever, locked their doors and windows before the sun set, fearing the werewolf would return to claim its next victims. John, tormented by guilt and fear, couldn't sleep. He knew the creature wasn't finished. He knew it would return, and this time, he wouldn't be lucky enough to escape. He could feel its presence, even when he was awake, like a shadow moving at the edge of his vision. And then, on the darkest night of all, when the full moon was at its peak, the creature came back to Willow Creek. The entire town was awakened by the howls. The dogs barked desperately, and the sound of claws scratching wood could be heard in several houses. John jumped out of bed, knowing the creature was there for him. He grabbed Mr. Johnson's gun, the same one that had been used on that fateful night in the forest, and went out to face his fate. He found the creature in the town square, surrounded by the shadows of the houses. The beast's eyes glowed intensely, reflecting the fear in John's eyes. He raised the gun but hesitated. The creature's eyes, so full of rage and pain, seemed to plead for something, for an end. "Samuel?" John whispered, almost expecting a response. The creature stopped, its eyes fixed on him as if recognizing the name. The howl that followed was long and sorrowful, filled with an anguish that cut through the air like a blade. The gun in John's hands felt heavier than ever, and he knew he couldn't do what Mr. Johnson had done. But the creature advanced, and John, in a final act of desperation, closed his eyes and pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot echoed through the empty streets of the town. And when he opened his eyes again, the creature was lying on the ground, its massive body writhing in agony. John approached slowly, and as the moonlight illuminated the fallen body, he saw the transformation reversing. The fur began to recede, the claws shortened, and before his eyes, Samuel returned to his human form. But it was already too late. Samuel, now back in the body of a man, looked at John with an expression of peace. He smiled, a sad and resigned smile, before taking his last breath. John stood there, tears in his eyes, watching as life left Samuel's body. The werewolf was dead, and with him, the curse that had haunted Willow Creek for so long. But the weight of what had happened, the guilt and the horror, would never leave the town. The people of Willow Creek found John at dawn, still beside Samuel's body. The news of the werewolf's death spread quickly, and the town was plunged into a mix of relief and mourning. Samuel was buried on a hill under the shadow of a large tree, where he could rest in peace, free from the curse that had tormented him. Even after Samuel's death, the townspeople continued to live under the weight of that legend. The children still told stories about the werewolf, and the elders kept their doors locked during full moon nights as if they feared the curse could be reborn. As for John, he was never the same. He left Willow Creek shortly after, unable to bear the memories that haunted him. It was said he was seen in distant towns, always searching for something, or perhaps running from his own demons. 15 years passed, and the legend of Samuel began to fade, until an unexpected return brought new shadows to Willow Creek. John was back. Those who recognized him were surprised. He was older, his face marked by the hard life he had led, but his eyes still carried the same shadow of guilt and pain that had driven him to leave the town. John didn't bring riches or grand stories with him. On the contrary, it seemed life had been relentless with him, hardening his spirit and deepening the scars left by the past. But despite everything, he felt an irresistible call to return to the land where it had all happened. On the day of his return, the town seemed frozen in time. The cobblestone streets, the wooden houses, and the surrounding hills were practically the same. But there was something different in the air, a stillness that hadn't existed before, as if Willow Creek was waiting for something. John noticed that while the town had remained physically unchanged, its spirit had evolved. The fear that once hovered over the community now seemed to have transformed into a somber acceptance of fate. He went straight to his mother's house, where he found the old woman still alive, but frail. She welcomed him with tears in her eyes, relieved to see him again after so many years. They spent hours together in comfortable silence until John finally asked the question that had tormented him since the moment he decided to return. "Mother, the full moon nights, are they still the same as before?" The old woman sighed, a tired and sad sound. "No, my son. The creature was never seen again, but the fear that never completely left us." That night, as the full moon rose in the sky, John went to the hill where Samuel had been buried. The wind whistled through the trees, and the shadows danced under the moonlight, creating shapes that seemed to move with a life of their own. When he reached the grave, the tree that grew beside it swayed gently, as if greeting him. John knelt by Samuel's grave, touching the cold earth with his fingers. He felt a strange sense of peace, as if he were finally fulfilling a part of his destiny. He stayed there for hours, until the first light of dawn began to tint the sky with pink. As he stood to leave, something caught his attention. On the ground beside the grave was a small stone, perfectly round and smooth. When he picked it up, he saw something engraved on it, an ancient symbol, a cross of protection against evil. He smiled slightly, understanding its significance. "Goodbye, Samuel," he murmured before turning to walk back to the town. That night, for the first time in many years, the windows of Willow Creek remained open, and the doors were left unlocked. The howling wind sounded different, softer, almost like a lullaby. The curse had finally been broken. John decided to stay in Willow Creek, no longer as the tormented man who had fled, but as someone who had faced his demons and found a new peace. He began to teach the town's children about the old stories, not to instill fear, but to help them understand the power of fear and how it can shape reality. He became a figure of wisdom, the man who survived the werewolf and returned to tell the tale. And although whispers about Samuel's curse still existed, they were now told as cautionary tales about the consequences of fear and isolation. The full moon nights continued to come and go, but now they were nights of peace. The children played under the moonlight, the townsfolk sang in the taverns, and Willow Creek flourished like never before. The tree on the hill grew, its roots firmly planted in the ground that once harbored the curse, now nourished by the strength of a town that had learned to overcome its own fears. And so, the legend of the werewolf of Willow Creek became more than just a story of horror. It became a story of redemption and renewal, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, there is always a chance to find the light. John's return brought a new era to Willow Creek, but the process of healing was slow and complex. Though Samuel's curse had been officially ended, the emotional and psychological scars left by the tragedy were still present in many hearts. However, John's presence in the town helped heal those wounds, even though he himself still carried a heavy burden. John devoted himself to restoring life in the town, but above all, he sought to forgive himself. He knew that for Willow Creek to truly thrive again, he would need to confront the ghosts of his past and find a way to live in peace with the decisions he had made. The first major change came when John decided to restore the old church in the heart of the town, a place that had been neglected since the height of the terror. He believed that the church, a symbol of faith and community, could help reunite the residents. He called on the townsfolk to help with the restoration, and gradually, people began to get involved. The church was restored to its former glory, with its white walls gleaming in the sunlight and a bell that now rang at regular times, inviting everyone to prayer and reflection. On full moon nights, John made sure the bell rang to ward off any memories of the dark past. The community, gathered in prayer, felt a new kind of security that came not just from the outside, but from within each person. The restored church became a symbol of Willow Creek's strength, not just as a place of worship, but as a gathering place where people could come together to discuss, learn, and support each other. Over time, the church began to host classes, community meetings, and even small celebrations, becoming the beating heart of the town. As time passed, the story of the werewolf began to change. What was once a tale of horror and fear gradually started to be retold with a different perspective, one that focused on Samuel's redemption and John's sacrifice to save the town. The townsfolk began to see the story as a reminder of the human spirit's strength in the face of fear and adversity. John became a near legendary figure, the man who had faced the werewolf and returned to guide the town into a new era. Children surrounded him in the streets, asking him to tell the story of Samuel once more. But now he did so with a softer tone, highlighting the lessons of courage, love, and forgiveness that the story held. Eventually, the story of the werewolf began to merge with other local legends, and Samuel came to be seen not just as a victim of a curse, but as a protective spirit of the mountains. It was said that on full moon nights, if someone heard a distant howl, it didn't mean danger, but rather that Samuel was watching over the town, ensuring that peace remained. The hills around Willow Creek became a place of pilgrimage, where people went to reflect and pray. The tree that grew beside Samuel's grave, now towering and robust, was considered sacred, and the townspeople left offerings at its base, asking for protection and blessings. One day, while working in the church, John found something that would change the way Samuel's story was told. Hidden between the boards of the old altar, he discovered a small wooden chest, covered in dust and nearly rotted by time. Inside the chest was a leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed and fragile, but still legible. When he opened the notebook, John discovered it was a journal, written by Samuel in the years leading up to his transformation. Samuel's words revealed a tortured soul, torn between human nature and the curse he believed he carried. He wrote about his love for Sarah, the pain of rejection, and the internal struggle to resist the darkness growing within him. More than anything, the journal showed that Samuel was not just a victim of a curse, but a man who fought against his own nature until the very end. In one of the last entries, Samuel wrote, "If I ever lose myself completely, I ask not to be judged by what I've become, but by what I tried to be. My love for this town and its people will always be greater than any darkness I carry." Samuel's words deeply moved John, and when he shared the journal with the townspeople were also touched. For the first time, they began to see Samuel not as a monster, but as a tragic hero, a man who fought against the darkness, and, in many ways, won. The journal was placed in a small display case inside the church, where everyone could read it. It became a symbol of forgiveness and understanding, a reminder that sometimes the true evil isn't in the curse, but in how people choose to react to it. As the years passed, Willow Creek prospered. The town became known not only for its dark history, but for the transformation that followed. Travelers from all over America and other countries began to visit the town, drawn by the legend of the werewolf and the story of redemption and forgiveness that accompanied it. John continued to live in the town, dedicating himself to caring for the church and guiding the townsfolk in the traditions and rituals that had now become an important part of life in Willow Creek. He never married, but he found peace in his role as a guardian of the story and as a counselor to those who came seeking wisdom. On full moon nights, the townsfolk still gathered at the church, but now, instead of prayers of fear, they sang songs of celebration and lit candles to honor Samuel's memory and keep the hope he represented alive. And so, the cycle was completed. The fear that once ruled Willow Creek was replaced by a more powerful force: love and community. The curse had been transformed into a blessing, and the town, once marked by tragedy, was now known as a place of healing and renewal. John lived his final years in peace, surrounded by friends and the community he had helped save. When he felt his time was coming to an end, he asked to be buried beside Samuel, on the hill where the great tree continued to grow. On the day of John's funeral, the entire town gathered. They buried him under the tree's shade, and as the full moon rose on the horizon, the church bell rang, echoing through the mountains. Everyone knew that, finally, both John and Samuel were at peace. The nights in Willow Creek were never the same again. Under the full moon, a reverent silence took hold of the town, not out of fear, but out of respect. and whenever someone heard a distant howl, they knew it wasn't a wolf they were hearing, but the soul of a man who had sacrificed himself for his town, ensuring that peace would reign forever. And so, the story of Willow Creek ended as it began, not with a scream of terror, but with a whisper of hope.